Japan's Navy was about to suffer its worst defeat, not from a battleship, but from a modified bomber built out of pure vengeance. Captain Paul "Pappy" Gunn stared at the monstrous creation before him. Where the glass nose of a B-25 Mitchell bomber should have been, there were now 8 50-caliber machine guns bristling forward, a violation of every regulation in the book. This wasn't just an unauthorized modification. It was an act of vengeance. His wife and 4 children were prisoners in a Japanese camp, and every day they suffered, his rage grew. He couldn't rescue them himself, so he decided to build a weapon that could end the war faster. What no one knew was that this machine, born from a father's desperate heart, was about to inflict the most devastating naval defeat Japan would suffer in the entire Pacific campaign. All because one man channeled his personal hell into a war-winning idea. The story of this weapon begins not in a workshop, but in the chaos of a collapsing world. December 8th, 1941, Manila. Paul Gunn, a 42-year-old retired Navy pilot running the new Philippine Airlines, watched from the ground as Japanese bombers systematically erased American air power from the sky. Within hours, his civilian planes were commandeered, and he was commissioned as a captain in the Army Air Corps. It was supposed to be a temporary return to service, but it became a 3-year odyssey fueled by a promise he couldn't keep. Gunn wasn't a typical officer. He was a former enlisted man, a Navy chief petty officer who'd spent 20 years learning aircraft, not from manuals, but with grease on his hands and the wind in his face. He knew planes inside and out, how they flew, how they broke, and how to fix them with whatever was lying around. But as Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, none of that expertise mattered. His wife, Polly, and their 4 children were trapped in Manila. In the frantic weeks that followed, Gunn became a legend, flying any plane he could get his hands on. He dodged Zeros, flew reconnaissance missions over enemy lines, and even survived being shot down, walking out of the jungle only to climb into another cockpit. He earned a Distinguished Flying Cross for flying an unarmed transport plane into the besieged fortress of Bataan, delivering life-saving medical supplies through a sky thick with enemy fighters. He could save strangers, but he couldn't reach his own family. On Christmas Eve, 1941, the final order came: evacuate to Australia. Gunn scrambled, pulling together every cent he had, preparing to get his family on the last flight out. But it was too late. The Japanese advance was a tidal wave, and they were cut off. He faced an impossible choice: disobey a direct order and likely be captured or killed alongside them, or fly away and leave them to their fate. He followed his orders. He flew to Australia, a decision that would haunt every waking moment for the next 3 years. Soon after, he received the news that shattered him. On January 7, 1942, Polly and the children were captured and imprisoned in the Santo Tomas internment camp. Something inside Gunn broke that day. The war was no longer about strategy or patriotism. It was personal. If he couldn't protect his family, he would annihilate the enemy that held them. Every ship, every plane, every soldier that kept the Japanese war machine running in the Philippines became a target for his rage. This wasn't just innovation. It was a promise of revenge. While Gunn's private war began, the official one was going terribly. In July 1942, Major General George C. Kenney arrived in Brisbane to take command of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, and what he found was a complete disaster. Morale was at rock bottom. The equipment was outdated and failing. Japanese Zeros owned the skies over New Guinea, and Australia itself was under threat. The theater commander, General Douglas MacArthur, had zero confidence in his airmen and made sure everyone knew it. Allied bombers were trying to sink Japanese ships from high altitude, and it was a catastrophic failure. B-17 flying fortresses were hitting less than 1% of their targets. From 20,000 feet, a ship had all the time in the world to maneuver out of the way. Meanwhile, Japanese convoys sailed with impunity, pouring fresh troops and supplies into New Guinea to kill Allied soldiers on the ground. The entire strategy was failing. Kenny was an unconventional thinker, a fighter pilot from World War I who knew that the rule book wasn't working. He needed a new idea, something radical that could actually sink ships. This kind of forgotten history, where a single audacious idea can change the course of a war, is what we explore in every video. These are the stories of mavericks and innovators who refuse to accept defeat. If you're fascinated by how these moments happen, take a second to hit that subscribe button and join us as we uncover more of them. Kenny had been toying with an old, dangerous idea from his instructor days: skip bombing. Releasing a bomb at extremely low altitude, just a few feet off the water, so it skips like a stone and slams into the side of a ship below the waterline, where the armor is weakest. The theory was sound, but the execution was suicidal. To get that close, a bomber had to fly directly into a wall of anti-aircraft fire with no way to shoot back. His pilots would be torn to shreds before they ever got close enough to drop a bomb. The problem seemed impossible. And then he found Paul Gunn. In August 1942, Kenny got a report that some captain in the 3rd Attack Group was performing unauthorized modifications on A-20 Havoc light bombers. He flew out to investigate and found Pappy Gunn, working almost alone in a makeshift workshop, scavenging machine guns from wrecked fighter planes and bolting them into the noses of bombers. Gunn, with no engineering degree but 2 decades of hands-on experience, had taught himself how to turn a bomber into a strafer. He'd ripped out the bombardier's station and replaced it with a battery of forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns. The idea was to come in at treetop level, guns blazing, to suppress enemy fire before dropping bombs. Most commanders would have had Gunn court-martialed on the spot for tampering with military aircraft, but Kenny didn't see a rogue mechanic. He saw the solution to his biggest problem. He immediately pulled Gunn onto his personal staff, made him a special projects officer, and gave him a new, impossible mission: convert every A-20 in the theater and do it yesterday. Gunn worked like a man possessed, driven by the images of his imprisoned family. He and his small team worked 18-hour days, fabricating parts, mounting guns, and personally test-flying every single plane. In September 1942, the new strafer A-20s hit a Japanese airfield at Buna. They came in at treetop level, and the effect was devastating. Japanese defenders, used to seeing bombers as slow, high-altitude specks, had no time to react. The attack was over in seconds, leaving dozens of their planes burning on the ground. It was a stunning success, and it proved Gunn's concept worked. But Kenny and Gunn knew the A-20 was just the beginning. They needed something bigger, with a longer range and a heavier payload. They needed the B-25 Mitchell. If Pappy Gunn could work his magic on the B-25, he wouldn't just be building a strafer. He'd be creating the ultimate ship killer. The B-25 Mitchell was a solid, reliable medium bomber, famous for the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. But for its intended purpose of medium-altitude bombing, it was just as ineffective against ships as the B-17. Pappy Gunn, however, looked at its sturdy frame, its twin-engine redundancy, and its spacious nose, and saw a blank canvas. Working in a hangar in Townsville, Australia, he began the most radical and technically illegal aircraft modification of the war. First, the bombardier and the entire glass nose section were removed. It was dead weight and a vulnerability at low altitude. In its place, Gunn and his team mounted a solid nose packed with 4 50 caliber machine guns, all wired to a trigger on the pilot's control stick. But 4 wasn't enough for Pappy. He designed and fabricated cheek blisters, mounting 2 more guns on either side of the fuselage. Then came his most audacious move. The B-25 had a dorsal turret behind the cockpit with 2 more machine guns. Conventionally, a gunner operated it to defend the plane. Gunn simply locked it in place, facing forward, giving the pilot control of those guns as well. The result was a monster, a medium bomber that now carried the forward firepower of more than a heavy fighter. 8 50 caliber machine guns, 4 fixed in the solid nose cone, and 2 each in blister packs mounted on either side of the fuselage, known as cheek guns, all wired to a trigger on the pilot's control stick. It was an unprecedented concentration of firepower on a single aircraft. But creating it was an engineering nightmare. The extra weight in the nose made the plane dangerously unstable. Gunn had to meticulously recalculate the center of gravity, shifting equipment and adding ballast to the tail just to make it flyable. The immense recoil from all 8 guns firing at once threatened to tear the nose apart, so he reinforced the entire forward section with extra bracing. Most importantly, he had to harmonize the guns, painstakingly adjusting each one so that all 8 streams of bullets converged at a single point hundreds of yards in front of the aircraft. He test-fired every plane himself, refusing to let any aircraft leave his workshop until it was perfect. By December 1942, an entire squadron was equipped with his new B-25 strafers. Now they needed a tactic just as radical as the plane itself. Gunn and Major Ed Larner, the squadron's aggressive commander, developed a terrifying new attack profile. The B-25s would approach enemy ships flying as low as 50 feet off the water at nearly 300 miles per hour. At that speed and altitude, they were almost impossible for naval gunners to track. At 1,000 yards out, the pilot would open up with all 8 guns. The storm of bullets would sweep the ship from bow to stern, shredding the superstructure, destroying anti-aircraft positions, and killing or suppressing the gun crews. The goal wasn't to sink the ship with bullets, but to neutralize its defenses and create pure chaos. Then, just a few hundred yards from the target, the pilot would release a 500-pound bomb with a 4 to 5 second delay fuse. The bomb, still traveling at 300 miles per hour, would hit the water, skip once or twice, and slam into the ship's hull at or below the waterline. The delayed fuse gave the plane just enough time to fly over the target before the bomb detonated underwater. The blast, amplified by the incompressible force of the water, could break a ship's keel, flood its engine rooms, and tear it apart from below. The entire attack, from first shot to detonation, took less than 15 seconds. The weapon was forged. The mad engineer had built his perfect instrument of vengeance. Now all it needed was a target. And in late February 1943, Allied intelligence served one up on a silver platter. Ultra, the top-secret code-breaking operation, intercepted a series of Japanese naval messages. A massive convoy was assembling at Rabaul. Its destination, Lae, New Guinea. Its cargo, 6,900 elite troops from the 51st Division, the reinforcements Japan was counting on to stop the Allied advance. The convoy would consist of 8 transport ships and a heavy escort of 8 destroyers. This was it, the single most important target to appear in the Pacific since Pearl Harbor. General Kenny knew this was his chance to prove his new weapons and tactics could work. He gathered every available plane in the theater, B-17s for high-altitude diversion, Australian Beaufighters for low-level strafing, P-38 Lightnings for air cover, and, of course, Pappy Gunn's modified B-25s, the stars of the show. His orders to the pilots were simple and brutal. Find the convoy. Sink every ship. At midnight on February 28th, the Japanese convoy steamed out of Rabaul. The commander, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, knew he would face attacks, but he believed the weather and his escort of destroyers and 100 Zero fighters would be enough to get the majority of his troops to their destination. He was catastrophically wrong. The convoy was spotted the next afternoon. For 2 days, Allied B-17s conducted conventional high-altitude bombing runs. As expected, they were mostly ineffective, harassing the convoy and slowing it down, but failing to sink any ships. The Japanese sailors grew confident, believing they had weathered the worst of it. They had no idea what was coming. At dawn on March the 2nd, the weather improved enough for the decisive strikes to begin. The convoy had been spotted the previous day, but proceeded confidently, with initial high-altitude B-17 attacks proving mostly ineffective and causing only minor harassment. That afternoon, the devastating low-level attacks commenced with Australian bowfighters leading the charge, their cannons and machine guns ripping across the decks of the destroyers and silencing anti-aircraft positions. Right behind them came the B-25s and A-20s, unleashing a storm of strafing fire and skip bombs. The slaughter continued into March 3rd when the convoy was just 30 miles from Leh. At around 10 a.m., additional B-17s struck first from above, forcing the ships to break formation and begin evasive maneuvers, further distracting the fleet before the low-level strafers and skip bombers followed to finish the job. Pilots descended to just 50 feet above the water, the salt spray kissing their propellers. One pilot lined up on the transport Kyokusei Maru. At 1,000 yards, he squeezed the trigger. The entire B-25 shuddered as 8 machine guns unleashed a torrent of lead. The stream of tracers walked directly up the transport, disintegrating the bridge and cutting down sailors where they stood. Then came the bombs. 2 500-pounders skipped across the water and vanished into the ship's hull. The pilot pulled up sharply, banking away as 2 massive underwater explosions erupted behind him, lifting the Kyokusei Maru out of the water before breaking its back. The ship sank in less than 15 minutes. It was a scene of methodical destruction, repeated across the water. The transport Teiyo Maru, packed with nearly 1,000 soldiers, was strafed until its superstructure was engulfed in flames before 2 skip bombs opened its hull, sending it to the bottom. The destroyer Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura's own flagship, was hit by strafing fire that killed almost everyone on the bridge. A bomb then hit the stern, detonating a magazine and blowing the back of the ship clean off. Japanese Zero fighters dove desperately to intervene, but the P-38s engaged them high above, leaving the B-25s to do their brutal work at sea level. The entire coordinated attack took about 40 minutes. When the first wave of Allied planes withdrew, the Bismarck Sea was a junkyard of burning, sinking steel. 4 transports and 3 destroyers were gone. That afternoon, the planes returned to hunt down the survivors. By nightfall, the massacre was complete. All 8 Japanese transports and 4 of the 8 destroyers were at the bottom of the sea. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead. Of the 6,900 troops sent to reinforce New Guinea, only about 1-200 ever made it ashore, most of them wounded and without equipment. Allied losses were stunningly light: 4 aircraft and 13 airmen. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was an annihilation, a turning point that proved land-based aircraft could utterly destroy a naval convoy. Pappy Gunn's illegal idea had worked beyond anyone's wildest imagination. This victory was a strategic earthquake. Japan would never again attempt to send a major naval convoy to resupply its forces in New Guinea. Their garrisons were now cut off, left to wither and starve. The success of Gunn's B-25 strafers was so undeniable that the manufacturer, North American Aviation, brought him back to the United States to help design factory-built versions. His field modifications became the blueprint for the B-25G H and J models, which incorporated even heavier armaments, including a massive 75mm cannon in the nose. These aircraft would go on to terrorize Japanese shipping and ground targets across the Pacific for the rest of the war. For Pappy Gunn, the war was still deeply personal. While his weapons system was winning battles, his family remained in captivity. He continued to fly combat missions even at age 45 until he was severely wounded during a bombing raid in late 1944, ending his flying career. But his personal war was nearing its end. On February 3, 1945, American forces liberated the Santo Tomas internment camp. After 3 years and 14 days of brutal imprisonment, Polly Gunn and her 4 children were free. They were emaciated and traumatized, but they were alive. Weeks later, in Australia, Pappy Gunn was finally reunited with the family he thought he might never see again. The man who had unleashed hell on the Empire of Japan finally had his family back in his arms. The war had changed them all forever, but they had survived. Paul Gunn retired a colonel, decorated with 9 Purple Hearts, a testament to a man who refused to stay out of the fight. His legacy wasn't just in the medals or the promotions, it was in the thousands of Allied lives saved and a war shortened by his relentless innovation. He died in a plane crash in 1957, doing what he loved most. But the weapon he created, born from a father's rage and a mechanic's genius, had already secured his place in history. It proved that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas don't come from a committee or a boardroom, but from the heart of one person who simply refuses to accept defeat.